Hello, everyone. This is Professor Salasi, and this is History 11, the social and political history of the United States. And I'm going to provide you with some information on Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. And I think these lectures will be split up. So I'll talk about what's important in Lecture 1, in Chapter 1, and then Lecture 2, Chapter 2, so that the video doesn't get too long. There'll probably um, be roughly probably about 45 minutes long for each particular lecture, and I'll try to keep it really short as much as possible. Pretty basically, you're going to need this information for one, because you're going to have to take a midterm exam, and also because you're going to need to write a reflection paper on Bernard Bailyn. And essentially, that reflection paper that you're going to write, you've got to be able to, or the better papers are ones that are able to take what's learned by reading Bailyn's chapters and then also merging that with a little bit of outside research that you have to do on JSTOR, and then merging that again with the research that you will do for reading Bernard Bailyn's "The People of the Peopling of the of North America." I should just briefly state that Bernard Bailyn wrote both of the texts that you're writing. So the entire textbook that you're reading, he is the author of that. And then the paper that you have to read on the peopling of North America was also written by Bernard Bailyn. So I don't want you to get confused about those two particular things, because it's the same author writing two different things. And what's important, and the reason why I have you read Bernard Bailyn, is simply because Bernard Bailyn was a really great American historian who spent a great deal of time trying to understand how the North American continent was populated by Europeans. And of course, this is going to have dramatic ramifications down the road, particularly with for Native Americans who will reap, the harvest of that North American invasion or settlement, and then also in terms of the economic growth of the United States in terms of slavery, and then what that impact will have on politics, and then later on we'll see that manifest itself right with these two great peoples, both from the North and the South, right, who will eventually go to war during the Civil War. So the first chapter, we're looking at the background of English colonization. And what you first should know from this is have an understanding of Spain's impact on colonization in the Americas, right? And so, from that particular perspective, and why we focus so much on Spain at this early point, although since the United States was a byproduct of British colonization and to some degree French colonization, there was less of an impact in terms of how we weigh French and British impact on the Americas, North America, and in contrast to Spain in terms of it from Mexico down to Central and South America. But what we use Spain for is to show the varying contrast between how that colonization played out. So Spain is a real good um, sort of measure or window to view British colonization. So the origins of that settlement differ remarkably because Spain proceeds very quickly in settling the territory that it claims, where England, right, takes about a half century. So a century is about 100 years. And so it takes about 50 years for England to colonize, whereas Spain does it very rapidly. And to some degree, right, and I probably should say not to some degree, but to a great deal, that difference in the rapidity of colonization would have massive impact on the North American continent. So I'll just give you an example. So for Spain, they're able to take their institutions that they have in Spain and quickly move them into their portion of the Americas, where in British North America, those institutions are very slow in coming over to North America. And so the Americans are able to build their own institutions, and over time, since they've built uniquely American institutions, and albeit there is some hint of Britishness within those institutions, they are quite independent of and remarkably different than those institutions that you would find in England. So England takes a great deal of time, and Spain proceeds rather swiftly. Spain's exploration of the West takes shape into three successive waves. And those particular waves are the first being with Columbus from 1492 to 1504, where here, within this time period, Spain is going to seize a great deal of land from Central America, the Caribbean, and even into Florida, right? So Spain is really good at moving and conquering these territories, or at least laying claim to those territories, where England is going to have just a little bit more difficulty, and it's going to proceed just a little bit slower. This is a map of Columbus's voyages, and some people think that Columbus came to the Americas once, went back, and was never seen again, and that's not quite true. Christopher Columbus had at least four voyages, and those are outlined here in the varying different colors. As you can see from the map, he's in Central America, South America. He goes through Cuba, Jamaica, Santo Domingo, which would later be Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, down into Guadeloupe, Martinique. And then if we go out towards the coast of Africa, Cape Verde, and Madeira, and the Canary Islands. And this is really important because what's going to transpire on these islands is the growth of sugar production, and sugar production is going to necessitate the need for forced or labor, which will turn into forced labor, which will mean that labor will either be comprised of those native people who already exist on those islands, or that labor needs to come from somewhere, and that will be eventually from Africa, right? So we can see from this map that Columbus really is moving across the Atlantic Ocean in order to be able to particularly do that. Now, there's just some certain things that you probably should know about Christopher Columbus. He was not a Spaniard or was he Portuguese? He was actually from Italy. He was Genoan extraction. And Columbus was not a great sailor at all. As a matter of fact, based on the maps that he had and also his own calculations, he thought the Earth was a lot smaller than it actually was. So when he landed in the Caribbean, he actually thought he was in India, and hence that's why indigenous people of the Americas have the name Indian, is because Columbus, even into his death, claimed that he had discovered India. And why India? Because people in Europe were interested in establishing trade with Asian India, and they sought a western route rather than an eastern route, because the eastern routes by land were blocked by Muslims, right, who were somewhat hostile to Christianity. So the proper way to go would then to be west, and they believed, or Columbus believed, that with his maps and charts that he could find a water route to India. And when he hit land in the Americas, he believed that he had in fact landed in India, which now, of course, we know, and most people by the time of Columbus's death, they knew that he was wrong, but sometimes ideas are hard to die. The second wave really came about because there were rumors of treasure, and that there was a highly civilized state in the interior of the Americas, and this was absolutely true. We're going to get the indigenous societies, the Aztecs, the Incas, and other groups, right, who will come in contact with the Europeans. So these rumors of great treasure and a highly civilized states were all found to be true, but this is going to spur on that second wave into the Americas. And this second wave was brought upon by people that we call today conquistadors, right? The conquerors. Specifically, the more famous of these conquistadors was Hernan Cortez, who would have his great battles with the Aztecs from 1519 to 1521. Alvar Nunez in northern Mexico, 1528 to 1536. Hernando Soto in Florida, 1539 to 1541. Francisco Coronado in the Southwest in 1542. So we begin to see these successive waves of Spanish explorers who were coming to the Americas in hope of finding treasure. Now, the question that really you're going to have to think about at some later date is why would they be seeking this treasure and why the exploration? We know that they're trying to, at least Columbus's goal was to try to establish trade in Asian India, but what's spurring that? Why trade? What is forcing these nations to look beyond their shore, right, is a unique set of circumstances. And we'll really get into this when we talk about mercantilism and this sort of the theory of economics that's going to play into this idea of why people and these countries need to go out for exploration. The third wave, we get Francisco Pizarro, who is in Central and South America from 1535 to 39. Pedro de Valdivia, South America, 1553. Now, the characteristics of the Spanish explorers were one where they were largely non aristocratic. Cortez himself was a lawyer by trade, but he wasn't a wealthy individual. So you think about that. Why does this matter? Is that money had to have been raised in order for these adventures, right? So if you have a lot of money, you could put up the money yourself and then take a large gamble and a large risk. And if you find something, that's fine because then your dividends will be able to be paid back. But if you don't find anything, then that money is gone, right? So these ventures needed to be funded by wealthy individuals, and usually the people that had all the wealth were noble people, right? Like the king and queen and dukes, etc. So if you weren't a wealthy aristocrat, you needed to be well connected or have the gift of persuasion. People like Christopher Columbus was able to persuade the court of Aragon and Castile, right, to fund his exploration. And so you can see why the fact that these Spanish explorers are mostly poor and non-aristocratic would play heavily into this, right? And why it is in many ways such a dramatic thing that they were able to raise the money and explore. Many of them were farmers, some of them illiterate, and like Columbus, somewhat unfamiliar with the sea. Later on, by the time we get deep into the British explorers, a lot of those individuals who would go out sailing are going to be really good seafarers, right? Really good seamen. And so their acumen in on the ocean is going to be pretty high. And of course, from that, we are able to see why England was able to spread its tentacles right across the globe. And they have the saying, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," and that is largely due to the fact that the British will get really good at sailing. And somewhat the Portuguese themselves were fairly good at that as well. But really, the characteristics of these early Spanish explorers are from poor backgrounds. They tilled the soil. Some could read, some could not, and not having a great familiarity with the sea. Now, one of the questions that comes up a lot from a lot of my students who begin to ask the question about how is it then that the Europeans were able to dominate these civilizations, particularly like the warring civilizations of the Aztecs. How were they able to dominate them? Well, one of the documents that you're going to read in this class is going to be Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. And this is a really fascinating document that I really think that students, right, who are approaching American history ought to read because it will help to explain the factors that went into European domination of the continent and the subsequent domination by the West in terms of technology, in terms of military might, and etc. Right? So, the United States, along with England, France, Germany, Italy, are formidable economic and military and political powers. And that came about by these sort of quirks in history that are characterized in this document that you're going to read by Jared Diamond. Now, what spurred Diamond's work was essentially uh, Diamond, who was a professor at UCLA, was having a talk with a friend of his who happened to be a black person on the island of Papua New Guinea, if my memory serves me correct. And the individual simply asked Professor Diamond, is that why do you white people have so much in the world and we black people, right, and meaning black, the darker skinned people of the world have so little? Why is it that the European uh, Caucasian, right, was able to spread its tentacles throughout the globe? And Jared Diamond thought that that was a very perplexing question. And so he spent a great deal of time writing this book and figuring out how this happened. And his book became a national bestseller. And I think he might have even won the Pulitzer Prize for that book, but that's something that you can just Google really quickly and find out. And so the basic thesis of Diamond's work is that the Europeans didn't do it because they were intellectually superior than anybody, that they were able to do this because they possessed the technology, which things like guns and also things like the compass, the wheel, right? These sort of things that we take for granted today that seem to be all around us. But in the 15th century, the time that Christopher Columbus was sailing, right, the compass was a very valuable and important instrument, something that you could probably buy at a Target store for a couple dollars, right? And back in those days, having a reliable compass was worth its weight in gold, right? So Diamond here then argues that germs was another important factor in the sense that these germs that the Europeans had spread quickly to throughout the native populations and basically decimated them, right? So we know that the germs that the Europeans had were germs that originated in animals. So in Europe, in medieval Europe, Europeans lived with their animals and were had suffered through varying periods where these diseases had ravaged the European populations, and so Europeans had over time built up immunities. And so, probably the greatest of these diseases was smallpox. So, how Cortez, with about 500 men, were able to subdue nearly 800,000 Aztecs was essentially because most Aztecs had come down with smallpox and were unable to put up any resistance to Cortez. So, here, what Diamond is doing is making the argument that guns, having the technology of weaponry, germs being spread to decimate the populations, and having technology were the necessary ingredients and factors for the Europeans to spread into North America. And then they did things like find um, bullion, gold and silver, copper. They were able to find large forests to build large ships and timber. Um, Vast oil reserves in the Americas early on, coal later would be found in the Americas. And so all these natural resources, right, aided and assisted and were essentially brought back to Europe to be turned into products that could be spread throughout the globe. And so it made Europe and eventually the United States economic and military powers. Right. So uh, Jared Diamond's book, right, the overall thesis is Euro civilization conquered others due to unique circumstances rather than by some type of superiority, right? So you'll have to hold on to this thought here and this idea because when we get to the prompt where you're going to have to write a reflection on genocide, that right, you'll want to be able to take this data from guns, germs, and steel and apply it in your answer, right, to really be able to deal with this kind of sort of quirk in history. So here, if we look at the technology, the Spanish had horses, weapons. the disease of smallpox, and the natives essentially what they had, even though they knew the territory, right, and that sometimes can be an advantage, really they only had small hand weapons, right? And so Cortez, who was one of the petty nobles, right, was able to take advantage of the Aztecs and essentially destroy the Aztec Empire. Individuals like Pizarro, who was born around 1471 or 76 and executed in 1541, would be able to use these very same technologies and diseases to conquer the Incas. And we can look at, and if you want to make these comparisons between Pizarro and Cortez, you can, because these are very interesting studies on human personalities. And so this picture here is intended to give you just kind of an idea of what these conquistadors probably look like. Now, some of you who have studied this idea of Cortez probably had heard at some particular point that when Montezuma met Cortez, Montezuma had believed that Cortez was actually a god, and that there was some fable that Cortez was going to show up. This individual was going to show up, and it fulfilled the prophecy. That is a lot of hokey nonsense. There was an excellent article written called Listening to the Indians and the Conquest of Mexico. You could probably Google that and find that document, where a researcher had went back to study this ideal and debunked that mythology, that false narrative. The Aztecs were not dumb people. They were a highly sophisticated society that in many ways was absolutely more sophisticated than the Europeans whom they met. And there is no indication that Montezuma believed that Cortez was a god. That story was perpetrated by the Spaniards to sort of justify and sort of show the Aztecs at a later date that they, in fact, their coming was prophesied by the gods rather than them being usurpers who, in fact, had, taken their land and destroyed their civilization, right? And so that's a narrative that actually came from Spain. It has no validity whatsoever within Aztec society at all. All right, and so here are some of the Spanish technology: the swords, the lances, the crossbows, and also the musket, right, which would have been an extremely valuable tool to have, right? And so this is the technology that was there to subdue the already sick population, right? And here is the native technology, where you have things like obsidian axes and spears. And so, not a whole lot of technology in terms of what could have been brought to bear to resist um, the Spanish domination. So, if you read my note here in terms of germs, you can see here that about some 20 million Native Americans died as a result of smallpox. That would have been highly devastating. We could just hypothetically say that there's about 7 million people here in Los Angeles. And so you're talking about wiping out the entire population of Los Angeles and in New York City. And we can throw in probably Chicago, Illinois as well. And that would be the gist of the devastation of population. At least 95% of the population died as a result of smallpox, right? And so it really, in theory, Cortez and the other conquistadors really didn't have to lift a finger in order to subdue the population. The germs did all the work, right? So here we can see that smallpox is a highly infectious disease. Now, I'm going to show you another slide in just a moment, and I need to warn you that it is, to some of my students, right, it is a very troubling and upsetting um, picture, but it is one where it shows the overall devastation of smallpox and what it did to the overall population, right? So here is an individual who suffers from smallpox, and you can see from that, had you have contracted smallpox, there was just very little that you could do. you'll probably, it could lead to blindness, and of course, it most oftentimes leads to death. And so the conditions during that period must have been absolutely horrific, and it probably and absolutely psychologically devastated the indigenous populations in the Americas, right? So Spain's domination covered about 8,000 miles from Southern California all the way down to the Strait of Magellan. And it also led to the unification of Spain and Portugal and Brazil, coming under later on, portion of it coming under Spanish authority, and then later on under Portuguese authority as well. Now, the Spanish Empire in the Americas was extremely well organized and very patriarchal. And what we mean by patriarchal is that we're talking about a system that stems from the king and the male nobles on down to the lesser nobles and down to the population. It was a highly bureaucratic society. And what I mean by bureaucratic, today we sort of have a negative connotation when it comes to bureaucracy, right? We think of bureaucracy today as being somewhat corrupt, slow, but that's essentially not what it means. The idea of bureaucracy actually came from the Ottoman Turks, right? As they began to conquer the Anatolian Peninsula, right, in Eurasia. And the reason why they instituted bureaucracy is because you wanted to be able to have a bureaucrat in one particular city who understands the laws and the regulations as the same a different bureaucrat in another city. So the point of a bureaucracy is that things are standardized. You're trying to eliminate as much corruption as possible, right? By having checks and balances, by having people who are looking over your shoulder, by you having to document all the things that you do. So the bureaucracy, where you have managers who are managing large numbers of people, right, is a point why Spain was able to conquer the Americas with great efficiency, right? The authority of the Spanish Empire was centered in the monarch of Castile. And the Castile, the term itself, is nothing more than a name of a family or the people that are part of this great family that conquered the Iberian Peninsula, where present day Spain is today. So when we say the monarch of Castile, or the Tudor monarchy or something to that nature in terms of England, we're talking about large family houses who then claim title to particular areas and kingdoms. The complex bureaucracy was formed by boards of trade. In particular, probably one of the most important ones was the House of Contracción, 1503, and this board licensed all trade with the Americas. So if you were an individual who wanted to do trade in the Americas, you would have to get a license from this particular board. So let's say that you were trying to do trade in, let's say, avocados or something to that nature, and you wanted to ship them from the Americas and sell them in Spain, you'd have to actually pay to get a license. And so what that does is that the Spanish government is reaping some money from the fees that are paying, and of course they're negotiating with you how much profit that they'll receive from your particular trade. They're also doing things like enforcing laws and regulations, collecting revenues, keeping accounts, all of these sort of things that you would find customary and things that actually go on today in terms of governments and how they deal with businesses as well. So the Spanish king and his advisors controlled that board, and also the Board of Trade also dominated both the civil and the religious life of the Americas. So they're not just interested in trade, they're also interested in ensuring that Catholicism is being spread and practiced, and that the rules and regulations handed down by the king and his advisors are being followed out to some great detail. Later on, this board would also be responsible for the welfare of the Indians, and this is going to be one of the real particular areas where you get within history some real questions about the relationship between Spain and other Europeans and native populations. And so when you're looking at your reflection essay on genocide, you might want to think about in terms of how the Indians were viewed and how they were treated by Europeans, and particularly groups like the Spanish and English and the French. They would have varying degrees of, or felt varying degrees of responsibility in terms how they dealt with these native peoples. So the French would have a system of dealing with native people, the English would have a system, and the Spanish would have a system. And by varying degrees, if you were a Native American who were dealing with the French, you might have been treated a different way than you would say be treated by the English and the Spanish. So that's something at least to pay attention to. Um, the next area or that you should think about are the viceroyalties and their relationship with what the territory that would be called New Spain and Peru. So essentially, what would happen in the Spanish Empire is that the territories would be divided into um, two regions, New Spain and Peru, and they would have royalties or viceroys who would be in charge of administering the edicts of Spain's advisors in that particular territory, right? So then below them you would have the audiencias, uh, royal courts and administrations, presidencias, and captains generals. So you having instituted, and Balin is really going to show you this, that you're going to have whole layers of bureaucracy that will be instituted within Spain. Now, there's going to be some question, and Balin really sort of touches upon this about whether or not Spain, which is literally 6 or 7 thousand miles away, how much of control are they going to have over these regions, right? And if you think about it, right, if you are working in, let's say, New Spain in 15, let's say 36, and it takes maybe a month or two for information and news to travel back and forth between Spain and New Spain, you probably might have somewhat of a free hand at administering things in New Spain that you perceive as the right thing to do, or you might be a person who's just somewhat negligent, and it takes months for people to find out that you're not actually doing the work that was given to you by the people or your bosses in New Spain. And so there might be some degree of autonomy that might exist within New Spain and Peru. But nevertheless, we can see here that we have these administrative subdivisions of government being instituted. And again, you have this whole bureaucracy. So the thing to take away here at this particular point, and what you should underline and stress, is that a whole waves of bureaucracy are being instituted within the Spanish Empire in the New World. And this will have ramifications later on down the road when these individuals who were born in the Americas, and they're not born in Spain, even though they are of Spanish ancestry, these Creoles or Creoles, how they are going to see themselves in relationship to their relatives who are back in Spain. So there is some clumsy gaps and weaknesses, and Brian and Balin's going to highlight some of these for you. But for the most part, the bureaucracy, right, is going to go unchallenged for over 300 years within New Spain, right? So it's going to take a considerable amount of time for people who are being born in these areas, right? And whole successive waves and generations of individuals are going to be born who are going to show fealty and allegiance, right, to the Spanish Empire, where in the Americas, things are going to deteriorate quite rapidly between the Americas and also between um, uh, the British Empire. So that is something that Balin is really going to highlight, and you should probably take note of that. Um, so we have no open, organized opposition and no body of ideas that are going to oppose the crown, and that's not really true in the British North America. So within the British Empire, you're going to have no effective structure of government. Authority is going to be completely scattered. The American political system, in terms of British control over that system, is going to be essentially weak. And there will be almost from the very beginning organized resistance to the British system from the start. I would probably imagine that there was some resistance to the Spanish system from the beginning, but there was no organized and effective resistance to that until generations later, right? So there is something to be said about the British venture that was nurturing and sowing already, almost from the beginning, seeds of resistance. So the Spanish American population is essentially going to consist of Indians, imperial office holders, Creoles, blacks, and those individuals who are racially mixed, right? So you're going to get this sort of melting pot of people within the Spanish Empire, and that is still borne out today, right? You can go to places like Brazil or the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and other areas, and you have black people who live there, right? And those populations would intermingle later on. So, for example, if you remember the name Hugo Chavez, or if you don't know the name, you can easily Google him. He was the duly elected president of Venezuela who argued and he gave a really fascinating speech where he argued that he was of African descent and indigenous descent and et cetera, and European descent and et cetera. And so you have this really cauldron of population that is going to mix within the British or Spanish Empire. Now we're going to just for a moment move forward and talk about the reach of the Catholic Church because it's going to play a fundamental role within the Spanish Empire and also in the French territory, and it'll almost have a almost no effect on the British um, exploration because at that particular time the Protestant Reformation will take place, and so the Church of England is created during Henry VIII's realm, and by the time his daughter Elizabeth takes control of the throne after his death, then what you're going to see is Protestantism being moved over into British North America, where we see Catholicism being brought over by the Spanish Empire. So, what we have is the Pope's global reach, and with that comes this idea of the doctrine of discovery. So, what you ought to do is think about how the church itself played or what role it played in the discovery of the Americas and how its role is really going to be the impetus for the global slave trade in the 15th and 16th centuries. The church is also going to have a heavy hand in instituting what we call the age of empires or the age of imperialism. So the Catholic Church is going to issue edicts, sort of rules or guidance for the new territory. The first one is going to come in the form of Dum Diversas 15, or excuse me, 1452. This one's going to allow the Spaniards to reduce what they called Saracens and pagans to slavery. So any person who is a Muslim or any person who practices a non Christian religion, a pagan, is going to be someone that can be targeted for slavery and have permission to do so by the Catholic Church. So if you think about this, that Africans are primarily practicing their indigenous religions or they're practicing Islam, and then of course the native people who are living in the Americas are practicing their own particular style of religions. So by 1452, the edict comes from the Pope that says that any people that you come into contact with that are not Christians, you have the right to reduce them to slavery. Now, what this is going to do is that it gives um, the Spanish and Portuguese Empire the ability then to use the indigenous people and Africans as forced labor, right? So the gold, the silver, and all the other precious bullion needs to be mined, and there are just not enough people, Europeans, in coming over into Spanish and Portuguese America and their territory. So that labor has to come from somewhere. Romanus Pontifex, 1455, which gave Portugal to the new right, Portugal right to new lands in Africa. The Inter Caetera in 1493 gave Spain rule over new lands to the west and to the south. So what Romanus Pontifex and the Inter Caetera did is that it gave Portugal, a Catholic country, the right to all the lands in Africa, and the Inter Caetera gave Spain the rights of all the territory in the Americas, right? So since uh, Spain and Portugal are both solidly Catholic countries, the Pope feels that he ought to reward, right, both of these two kingdoms with the ability to um, hold on to that land by papal edict. Whereas England, which is a Protestant country, therefore does not get the same rights to that territory, right? So here, that territory that England seizes will have to be territory that will later be taken from the French at a much later date. So if you want to read the language, you can Google this, but I've just showed you just very briefly the language in Dom de Versailles, where it says, "We grant you, kings of Spain and Portugal, by these present documents, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans, and any unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and reduce their persons into perpetual slavery." So I know what you're thinking, the hubris of an individual to just write an edict that says that the kings of Spain and Portugal has the right to subjugate people in the New World. Now, how is this possible? Well, for Catholics, at this particular time, they believe that the Pope is the direct link between God and everyone else on earth, that the Pope has a direct line, so to speak, where he can speak and has the power directly given to him by God, right? So if the Pope gives you that edict, it is essentially the same as giving an edict from God. So people would not have questioned, at least early on, the Pope's ability to render whole populations free for the taking and whole lands free for the taking by Catholics, right? This is something that would have been seen as quite normal and not rather stunning whatsoever to European peoples, right? So that's something that at least that you could think about and an angle to take in your writing your paper as you begin to discuss genocide is, where did that authority come from? Well, it comes from papal authority. And where did that papal authority come from? Well, it's argued by the Pope that this is essentially coming from God. So here, what we're going to see from Dom de Versailles is that these two kingdoms of Portugal and Spain are going to start competing for territory. And these two groups eventually will bump into each other. and they will contest each other over territory. And Portugal will threaten to go to war against Spain, and this is going to be alleviated, as Balin is going to show you, by the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which literally divides the world between Spain and Portugal. So if you notice towards the lower left hand portion of the map that you're looking at, you see a line drawn, a dark black line drawn, and on the right side of that land, that territory belongs to Portugal, and on the left side of that line, that territory would belong to Spain. So that particular green area towards the lower left corner is actually where the present country of Brazil sits, and it is the only country in South America that does not speak Spanish. And so, if you notice that portions of it are in Portuguese territory, and so over time, the Portuguese would eventually take over that particular territory. Spain would cede it over to the Portuguese, and so that's why people in Brazil to this day speak Portuguese rather than Spanish. Right? And so here is a map that shows you the territory a little bit better. England's expansion overseas was extremely slow. And I've talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the lecture, right? So you should have some fundamental awareness of this already. It was also absolutely muddled in purpose, and the land created more loss than profits, right? Where you see people like Cortez and other groups finding large sums of gold and silver, right? There were no riches to be found by English explorers in the New World. So they would incur lots of losses in the beginning, yet they would find ways to make money off the colonies at a much later date. But really, there was no gold or silver or any other precious metal to be found in the territories that they occupied. How England would get its gold and silver would be from simply creating pirates, or the idea of piracy. And as those Spanish ships were crossing the Atlantic, the English would just wait for them, and they would just hijack the ships and steal Spanish and Portuguese gold and silver, right? So I guess one way to do that is, if you can't find any gold and silver, the other thing that you could do is just reasonably steal it. So England is going to show very little interest in inserting its claims in the New World early on, but that's going to drastically speed up over time. Here is a map of English or European exploration in um, North America, and you can see from here, if you look extremely closely, you're going to have the Dutch, who will be settling in the area today that we now know of as New York, the Vikings in places like Nova Scotia, the English, the French, and of course the Spanish towards the south and the southwest, right? So North America, you're going to have at least 4 or 5 different groups, right, who are going to be, or European groups who are going to be exploring this particular territory. And of course, where all the gold and silver is out in the Californias and in the Dakota Hills, but none will be found in the East Coast. And so the Europeans are going to have to find other means like beaver trade and et cetera in order to be able to earn the kinds of profits that they had hoped to find. So the English moved towards colonization in the 1550s. And we see this shift in motives, and why England begins to colonize largely has to do with this idea of mercantilism, which you'll go over a little bit later. But we also begin to see some shifting in the structure of the English economy in terms of what we call the enclosure movement. Now, Balin goes into this with some detail, so I won't belabor the point here. But what the enclosure movement essentially is that the wool trade is exploding in Europe, and so nobles within England are kicking its population off the land, and people who had spent generations tilling the land and reaping the food production from the land, they're kicking them off the land to graze sheep, right? And so these people who are being kicked off the land then have to find work in the cities. And if they don't find work in the cities, then these individuals will have to be taken care of by the English government. So, an alternative to this would be to send the English poor over to the Americas, right, where they can settle instead of them being a burden on the English government. And so from this, we get the formation of English commercial companies, the Guinea Company, Muscovy Company, Levant Company, and the East India Company, right? And we'll also, from this, we see the English pirate ventures of John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake, and the probing by these individuals into the Western Hemisphere, again, looking for routes to Asian markets, the same that Christopher Columbus was looking for just a few decades earlier. Right? And again, Balin talks about this to some great extent. So make sure that you just get a sense of in your mind that the English venture is going to be somewhat muddled. They're not going to find the amount of riches that they had thought that they would find early on. And so they're going to have to divert their attention to finding other sources of wealth. The first attempts at colonization were in Nova Scotia and New England in 1578 by Humphrey Gilbert, and that expedition led in absolute failure. We get Richard Hakluyt's discourse concerning Western planting in 1548, where he writes this treatise where he says that it's England's duty to Christianize American pagans and to colonize the Americas to have a base of operations for attacks. And what they're talking about in terms of attacks are the French and the Spanish, etc. They're enemies on the European continent. And what they're doing is, at least what Hakluyt is trying to do here, is that he's saying that what they need to find are exotic goods for commerce. And they eventually will find things like beaver skins, right, where the whole rage in England is for a beaver skin coat. So trade will be done that way. But there'll be other things like lumber, fish, later on, cotton, indigo, rice. So there will be some commodities that will be gained from this, but that comes at a much later date. So Hakluyt here is saying that the colonies are going to, or have the potential to, absorb England's population, new markets for English goods, and possibly finding routes into Asia. Now, there are going to be 3 English settlements in Virginia. One of the more important ones are on Roanoke Island in 1585, where you're going to have these successive waves of people, 18 men in 1586 and about 117 men, women, and children in 1587. And this will result in what they call to this day the Lost Colony. Right, so here is a sketch of Hakluyt and Gilbert Humphrey. Now, the characteristics of early English expansion are entirely private, unlike the expansions of Spain, where it is completely government supported, where the bureaucracies of Spain move over into the Spanish Empire. The English are going to rely heavily on private expansion. The English government is not particularly interested in spending all of its treasure on expansion. And again, once you go over mercantilism, you'll have a great understanding of why this occurs, right? So I won't sort of give it away here, but needless to say, that the English are extremely ambivalent about spending its own particular treasure in these adventures, so they're going to rely heavily upon private expansion. And of course, this means that the expansions are going to be slow and extremely uncertain and, for the most part, incompetent. So let's look at the characteristics of the English explorers and sort of buttress them against Spain, where here you have the English gentry, the nobility, right? They're typically the second and third sons. They are extremely literate and very ambitious and extremely familiar with seafaring. So you can see from this that just in terms of the overall characteristics of the English, they come from a more learned background than the Spanish, but the outcomes are significantly different, right? So in many ways, you could probably ask yourself, is that why is it that Spain, their conquistadors were largely from the poor, ranks of the poor, and the illiterate, and have a unfamiliarity with the sea, but their ventures reap the rewards of lots of bullion, as opposed to the English, where returns on their investment won't come until many decades later. That this is something to at least to hold in your mind and to think about. The role of the state essentially takes on this idea of moving this, or being interested in moving the English population from England, particularly cities like London, where the population expands from about 60,000 in 1500 into just 100 years to about 200,000. That is a rather large population growth, to say the least, in such a small period of time. And these people have to be fed. The Queen Elizabeth believed and asserted that one of her roles as head of the English people was to ensure that every person in England had stable employment, right? That they wanted to have 100% employment. And that's something very hard to do when the population explodes, right, from 60,000 to 200,000 in essentially 100 years, right? So the idea here being is that if you're opening up new territory in the new world, right, why not send some of the population, right, this particularly the underemployed, the English poor, over into English territory. So the English capital is going to come from English investors, people like Thomas Smith. The English state will remain almost silent or play such a minor role, and so they would remain essentially steadfast in their insistence on keeping their rule in the territories at a minimum, right? And probably what is spurring this is that if you're not finding many goods in the territory, why expend your own capital to do that, right? It just wouldn't make any economic sense. So there's going to be lots of financial limitations. There's a time period where that they called starving time, which is outlined in the Balin book, where things are not going well for the English. You have the end of the Spanish War in 1604, and with that comes a slow churning where the English are able to focus a little bit more time on overseas expansion. And this would come through the reigns of James I and then Charles I, 1603, 1625, respectively. Now, the English have been practicing expansion for a number of years. and they've been practicing their expansionist role on the island, on the Irish island, and they are practicing their expansion with the subjugation of the Irish territory. Now, one of the things that they learned from this is that once they make their incursion into the Irish territory, that it's extremely difficult to subjugate the Irish chiefs and bring them under military control. And this is going to have significant ramifications at a later date for how the English um, deal with the North American continent, in terms of, particularly in terms of how they deal with Native Americans, right? So Ireland is essentially going to be used as a model for American colonization, where Spain really doesn't have a model. They haven't been practicing colonization. They've been trying, and particularly the Portuguese have been trying to some extent to make inroads in Africa, but not to the degree where they're trying to colonize Africa, or at least not early on. They will do this at a later date. But the English had been trying to colonize and subjugate Ireland, and so the methodologies that they use to be able to do that will be sort of applied over to North America. Now, one of the areas that I would like you to focus in on in this particular chapter is this idea of the Columbian or Grand Exchange. Now, what we mean by this is that the voyage of Europeans are going to bring about dramatic changes to both the American continent and the European continent. So not only are you going to have people who are moving from both of the continents, but you're going to have a large movement of plants and animals to and from the Americas, and this will have significant consequences for both continents. And here is a map that kind of shows, if you look at this really closely, that things are moving from continents. People, slaves, goods of all kinds from all continents. And so this is why you, by and large, right, have things like oranges in Lebanon, and then you would end up having oranges being grown in California and Florida, right? So that is something to think about, and how all of these goods and material, right, and plants and animals are being moved around. And so we're really seeing at European exploration the real seeds for globalization is already being instituted and started from the very beginning. So things like wheat, oranges, lemons, horses, and even things like smallpox are all moving from Europe over into the Americas. Things like corn, potatoes, chocolate, sunflowers, and rubber are being moved from the Americas over into Europe. So, for example, when I was living in Italy, there were many people who grew corn in their backyards, right? So it was not uncommon to see plots of land where people had grown, a considerable amount of corn in their backyards. And so you'd wondering, well, where would they get this corn from, right? With the maize. And you knew where they got it from. They got this from the Americas, right? So it's something that you can find, these staple and products you can find at just about everywhere, all over the world, right? And that is largely due to European conquest. And you also get things like syphilis, right? So syphilis is largely unknown in the European continent. And so when Europeans have sex with indigenous people in the Americas, they're contracting this disease and they're spreading it back in Europe. All right, so this is going to close out our discussion. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me.